This document, the Declaration of Independence, states clearly that all men are created equal. But while those words were being written, the men writing them were financing their revolution through the labor of enslaved Africans. By the late 1700s, millions of people were held in brutal, systemic chattel slavery, while indigenous tribes were simultaneously pushed off their ancestral lands to make room for new colonies. The new nation relied on the total subjugation of human beings to generate the wealth necessary to survive its first few decades. The democratic experiment required an underclass to physically build it. A republic attempting to balance individual liberty with widespread enslavement creates a massive structural flaw. Eventually, the bill for that ideological debt would come due. This map of the early United States shows how loosely bound and highly fractured the 13 colonies were following the Revolutionary War. The fragile new government struggled to mediate deep economic and political disputes between the northern and southern regions. To save the collapsing republic, delegates drafted a new framework in 1787. This document, the Constitution, established a unified federal government and divided power into 3 distinct branches. Yet embedded within its clauses were specific protections for the institution of slavery. The delegates agreed to these terms to ensure the Southern states would ratify the document and join the Union. The architects of the government secured immediate political unity by writing human bondage directly into the law of the land. That compromise ensured the country would survive its infancy, but guaranteed a violent crisis decades later. By the 19th century, the United States turned its attention west. A belief took hold across the country known as manifest destiny. This was the conviction that Americans had a divine, unquestionable right to inhabit and conquer the entire North American continent. This map shows how, through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, the United States acquired millions of square miles of land, multiplying the total size of the nation in a matter of decades. That land was already occupied. In the 1830s, the federal government forced the relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans. During the grueling march known as the Trail of Tears, exposure and starvation claimed roughly 15,000 lives. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, migration accelerated rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of prospectors flooded the territory, establishing booming economies and demanding statehood. Every new territory added to the map forced a dangerous question onto the floor of Congress. Would the new state allow slavery or ban it? Each mile of westward expansion threatened to tip the delicate balance of power between free and slave states. Legislators tried to manage the tension by allowing settlers in new territories to vote on the issue themselves. Instead of keeping the peace, pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions flooded into regions like Kansas, specifically to influence the elections. The political debate turned to bloodshed. Radical abolitionists like John Brown took up arms, killing slave owners in Kansas, and later attempting to incite an armed slave rebellion by raiding a federal armory in Virginia. Then, in 1860, the Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. Though he ran on a moderate platform, Southern leaders viewed his election as a direct threat that the federal government would eventually abolish human bondage entirely. South Carolina seceded from the United States that December, followed quickly by several other Southern states. They began confiscating federal forts, and by April of 1861, artillery fired on Fort Sumter, launching the American Civil War. Over the next 4 years of total war, massive armies repeatedly clashed across the continent. By the time the Confederacy surrendered in 1865, roughly 600,000 soldiers were dead. The nation had finally been forced to resolve the contradiction written into its founding documents. The institution of slavery could not coexist with a government claiming all men are created equal. With the Union victory, the federal government took aggressive legislative steps to align the country's laws with its original ideals of liberty. During the period known as Reconstruction, Congress passed 3 vital amendments to the Constitution. They officially abolished slavery, granted citizenship to all those born in the United States, and guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or previous servitude. For the first time, millions of formerly enslaved people were recognized as citizens. Federal troops occupied the South to protect these new rights, allowing Black Americans to participate in local elections and secure political representation. For a few short years, the gap between the nation's actions and its rhetoric closed. The protections of the Constitution theoretically applied to everyone. However, following a contested presidential election in 1876, a political compromise ended Reconstruction. The federal government withdrew its troops from the South, abandoning its enforcement of civil rights. Almost immediately, Southern states implemented Jim Crow laws. This new system enforced strict legal segregation, systemic violence, and widespread voter disenfranchisement, effectively stripping Black Americans of their newly won freedoms. At the same time in the West, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad vastly accelerated industrial expansion. This final conquest of the frontier cemented the fate of remaining native tribes, isolating them onto permanent reservations. The American story remains defined by the friction between soaring rhetoric and physical practice. Generations of citizens continue a turbulent, centuries-long struggle to fulfill a promise that was written long before it was ever intended for everyone.